Hello everybody, and welcome to this brief video that is going to explain just a little bit about the handout that summarizes the series convergence tests. Hopefully this handout was sent to you in a Canvas message sometime recently, and this first page is just a summary of all the convergence tests that we've talked about. It gives you a list of them, talks about some of the conditions under which the tests apply, and then just gives some general advice on when you might consider using that test. So let's just talk through a couple of points of this. Okay, so the first thing on our list here is the comparison test, and actually, we called it the limit comparison test, so let's add that word there. Okay, they tell us for this test, if we want to use it, we need the terms in our series to be positive, and then just gives us some general advice that this particular test is useful if our series resembles either a p-series or a geometric series. You might remember that using the limit comparison test was about looking at dominant terms and finding either a p-series or a geometric series that's similar to the series that we're given. Okay, and then another test that came up was the ratio test. Okay, and the one piece of advice for using this test that I think is the most helpful is remembering that you really only want to use it if you have one of two things in your series, if there are factorials involved, or if there are constants other than 1 or -1 raised to powers. And really, those are the only two situations in which you want to try the ratio test. Okay, if you don't see either of those two things, then probably what's going to happen is that you're going to take the limit and you're going to get 1, which is inconclusive, and you would waste a lot of time for nothing. You would have to use a different test. Okay, and then we come to the test for divergence next on our list. And the one thing that's mentioned here is to remember that it can only be used to show divergence. It doesn't help us to prove that a series converges, but can be used to give a relatively simple argument, usually, that a series diverges. Okay, and then absolute convergence test, we're actually skipping that this semester, so you can cross that one off your list. We won't worry about that one. Okay, and then we come to the last two, the alternating series test. Okay, and that's kind of just as the name implies, so you would use that test if your series is alternating between positive and negative terms. The series must be alternating. And its limitations are it can only be used to show convergence. It's never going to help us to show that a series diverges. Okay, and then finally, at the bottom of our list here is the integral test. And the comment that I'd make here is, I would consider this to be kind of a last resort test. Okay, so you want to use it only if there's no other test that works well. Okay, so that's kind of the comment that they're making here. Use it as a last resort and only when the corresponding function can be integrated. I'd like to add a word to that statement, easily integrated. There may be times when you in theory could use the integral test, but the integral that you would have to do is so difficult that it would probably be easier to use a different test. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. You really want to only use this test if you can do the integral without too much difficulty. Okay, so there's kind of a summary of the test just at a glance. And on the second page of this handout, there's a flowchart. Okay, and this is meant to be a suggestion of what order you might try convergence tests on. So, for example, when you're doing problems, writing series convergence proofs, you have to make a decision as to what series test you want to use. That can be challenging at first. We've got all of these tests, and how do we decide which test to apply first? Okay, you can actually go in any order you want to. You may very well develop your own system. You don't have to follow this flowchart, but at the beginning, when you're new to this, you might find it helpful to try and go in this order. Okay, so just point out a couple of things on this chart. So notice first that the test for divergence is relatively up near the top of the flowchart. The reason for that is that that's usually a pretty easy test to apply if it works for us. So I like to try that one early. If it doesn't work, we could just move down our flowchart and maybe try the ratio test next. Remember, the ratio test should only be applied if there are factorials. Or constants raised to variable powers. That was the same comment that was made back on the previous page. If you don't see either of those two things in your series, you would move down on your flowchart and ask yourself the question, are all the terms in my series positive? And if they are, then one of these two tests is probably going to be your choice, the comparison or the integral test. On the other hand, if some of the terms are positive and some are negative, we already said that we're not using the absolute convergence test, so really kind of the only choice would be the alternating series test in that case. Okay. And that's kind of, just at a glance, the flowchart and the summary of the test. So feel free to use this handout as you're doing problems. You might find it to be a useful tool, especially at first.